Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Here we are, a week into the second administration of President Donald Trump. It's certainly a time of change, some of which is certainly expected and some perhaps not. Do we really need to rename North America's tallest mountain, Denali, in Denali National Park and Preserve? This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. There is much going on in the federal government, and not all is good. Hiring freezes are underway. There's much talk about reducing the federal budget, which requires cutting agency funding. To try and gain some clarity on what's beginning to go on and what impacts it might have on the National Park System and the National Park Service, we're joined today by Kristen Brengel, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Parks Conservation Association. We'll be back in a minute with Kristen.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome back to the Traveler, Kristen. Good to have you.
Thanks, Kurt. Good to be with you.
It's been a week since President Trump was inaugurated for his second term in office. Change is coming quick this time. I mean, you have the normal changes that you see when one administration takes over for another one, but it seems like there is a definite plan coming in terms of how President Trump wants the government to function. Some of those issues are going to impact the national parks. For instance, he does not believe in climate change, and climate change impacts have been battering some parks, as you well know, and threatening others with sea level rise. Any insights into whether the next director will continue, the next Park Service director will continue to push for funding to mitigate those impacts and perhaps build some climate change resiliency into the parks, or is that a chapter that has closed?
The chapter can't close on climate resilience because of the fact that we keep seeing the impacts from climate change, whether it's wildfires. Right now, the wildfires in Southern California are still raging, and I haven't seen a report yet on whether or not Santa Monica Mountains is in the clear, but parks are going to be right in the middle of all of these natural disasters. We still have the results of Hurricane Helene and the Great Smokies and some of the southeastern parks, and none of this seems to be stopping anytime soon. So whether it's Congress that needs to fund disaster relief or the Park Service needing funds to get out ahead of some of these problems, they can't stop working on them. It's going to be impossible to stop working on them. And so the unfortunate thing is that Congress will likely be on the disaster side and not the proactive side of funding. And that's what we're worried about over the next at least 2 years, is where appropriation budgets are going to be and how much flexibility the Park Service will have to direct funding on some of the issues that we know are just continuing to happen. As you know, Kurt, the Park Service has done these vulnerability studies, and it's going to be really important for them to keep implementing them.
No, absolutely. I guess the concern from what I've seen so far is the new administration has already moved to rescind some of the funding that was made available under the Inflation Reduction Act for some agencies. And as we reported a week ago, the House Ways and Means Committee has identified Inflation Reduction Act's funding for the Park Service as one possible area to pull the funds back. And if they do that, sure, the Park Service still has to deal with it, but how are they going to fund these things?
And we're hoping to lobby to not rescind that funding. As you may know, Kurt, that particular funding had great interest from many parks, and more parks. It has shown that I think it's quadruple. Parks have asked for quadruple the amount of funding that was in the Inflation Reduction Act specifically for these resilience projects. So I'm hoping that once Congress sees the types of projects that are getting funding under the IRA, that they'll want to continue to pursue those and not claw back the funding on them.
Yeah, definitely something to watch. I guess there's kind of a political battle in Washington over what's going to happen first in terms of deciding what to rescind, what taxes to raise, what taxes to lower. It's all going to be very interesting political theater to watch. One other thing that was interesting in the Ways and Means Committee's rough outline, and again, it was just an outline, it wasn't marching orders for the committee, was possible federal land sales. As you know, the Traveler's been around for quite some time, and once upon a time, the current chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith from Missouri, talked about it would be better if Ozark National Scenic Riverways was run by the state of Missouri as opposed to the National Park Service. I'm just wondering if there was just a coincidence that his committee's outline mentions federal land sales and his desire to see Ozark Rivers turned over to the state.
I can't speak to that example, but there's definitely a movement right now to move federal lands into state hands, and that would change the way that we live our lives in America these days. States manage lands differently from how we manage some of these federal lands, and if we actually start talking about moving park land to states, that would be extremely undesirable for the American public who loves visiting these places and having them there to access. So I think people they float these ideas out. And even where you're sitting in Utah, the state of Utah got incredibly aggressive about trying to say that they should have federal lands, 18 million acres in Utah. And so these attempts continue to happen. The American public should reject them. It would change the management. And even though, Utah has a reputation of managing for recreation, they, a lot of times they prefer off-road vehicles over other forms of recreation that folks enjoy and just sightseeing that people enjoy. So there would be consequences to doing something like that. And I think we in America love our national parks. We love our public lands. We want to be able to do our activities on public lands and go sightseeing and wildlife watching. And much of that could get diminished if some of these ideas ever came to fruition. But in all of our years of working, Kurt, I think we've seen so many attempts at trying to minimize the federal footprint or even sell national parks. And the public, time after time, has rejected these proposals. And so I don't expect that to change. And I continue to beat this dead horse, but parks are absolutely more popular than they ever have been in history. Over 320 million people have visited our national parks. It's almost the equivalent to the population of America. This would just be, all of these ideas are just hugely unpopular and we believe will be rejected.
It might have been not all the way back in the last century, but early in the 21st century, one of Utah's former representatives, I think Mr. Hansen had proposed a decommissioning commission to get rid of some units of the National Park Service. As you no doubt recall, he said if you've been to Great Basin once, there's no need to go back. Great Basin National Park. And there has been talk in past years about turning some units of the park system over to the states. And of course, at the time that those discussions were underway, a lot of states were closing down their own state parks because they couldn't afford them. They were running into budgetary issues. You know, Kristen, recently we ran out our fourth annual Threatened and Endangered Park series, and one of those discussed the political consequences, frankly, of the Trump administration coming in. And one Park Service veteran who had watched the first Trump administration told me that, you know, there might be some consideration of giving some smaller units of the park system that don't attract a lot of visitors or don't have many full-time employees over to states, or perhaps even let concessionaires run them. Have you heard anything like that?
I haven't heard anything like that in the DC hallways. But as you said, these places take effort to manage, even if they're small. Someone has to open them in the morning and accept visitors and take people on tours and maintain these places. And it's not, you know, we know from the maintenance backlog that maintaining these older historic sites is not cheap. And so, you know, I think at the end of the day, these ideas, you know, whether it's small, big, you know, in terms of the size of the parks, I just think they're just unpopular, and people love these places. And one thing I've always noticed around DC is that even these smaller parks have these constituencies that just love these places and take great care of them. And so I just, again, I think these ideas are just totally unpopular. And as you said, in many cases, the states can't afford to maintain them themselves. So why would they take them on as an asset?
Just as an aside, you know, you're talking about how popular the parks are, and over 300 million people visited them in 23. We haven't seen 24 figures just yet. I saw a story the other day that from Great Smoky Mountains National Park that visitation went down, and what that was attributed to was the National Park Service recalibrating how it counts visitors. So, you know, if they do that to Great Smoky, I'm sure they're doing it to all the parks. I'm just kind of curious what the numbers for 24 will show, if we're still above 300 million or if that really was a soft number. Just something to watch for in the weeks ahead. You mentioned the maintenance backlog. I mean, that's another issue that we have to see what's going to happen. During the first Trump administration, of course, he signed the Great American Outdoors Act into life, which brought in federal funds across the land management agencies to help address backlog maintenance. It wasn't enough. The job's not done yet. How are things looking there? I know you guys at MPCA have been working hard to gin up support for reauthorizing it in some form or fashion.
Well, let me just add to what you said in the first part of your question. The Trump administration didn't just sign the Great American Outdoors Act into law. They helped lobby and make the case for the need for it. So they were very much involved in getting that bill passed. And so we feel like we can harness that same energy this time around to do a reauthorization or really an extension of the law. As you might know, Senators Daines and King and Warner and Kramer introduced last year an extension, and that would have been for 8 years. So we're working with them to make sure the bill gets introduced again this year, and then working to get a House companion. And we feel like there's continued enthusiasm to extend that money. It's been an incredible program, very efficient, and the Park Service has done a wonderful job implementing. We put together these books that we hand out on Capitol Hill of just the pictures of all of the parks that are under construction. And many Hill offices ask us, it's great that the bridges are getting fixed in Yellowstone and the roads and the water systems, but are the toilets getting fixed and are the campsites getting fixed? So we create these books, these picture books that show everything from, these magnificent bridge rehab projects in the parks, but also the new toilets and the campsites and the trails that are getting fixed both in the Park Service, Forest Service, BLM. And so we feel like so much progress is being made. This has been such a successful effort that many in Congress will want to continue to see it through. And you may have watched the nomination hearing for Governor Burgum for the Interior Secretary. In that hearing, Mr. Daines asked him if he would support reauthorizing the Legacy Restoration Fund under the Great American Outdoors Act, and he said absolutely. So we're excited to work with him on it, and believe that we can probably move this forward. So what I want is to not have to keep reauthorizing every 5 years. What I would prefer is if we could do 8 to 10 years, and that way the Park Service and the other agencies that get funded by it have plenty of time to plan and make sure that the projects, they have a good flow of projects and contractors. So, but I'm excited about being able to reauthorize that bill, and I think it's been an amazing program for the Park Service. So I think park visitors are really going to see the improvements and be very excited about the sort of the freshening up of the parks.
The freshening up. You mentioned Governor Burgum and his confirmation hearing. He's all in on energy exploration development. Any insights on how that might be at risk with the national parks? I mean, President Trump already has reversed the blockage of the Ambler Road, 211-mile access road that's
They haven't
across
reversed
states.
it yet.
I thought he did in an executive order.
No, it just creates steps to look into it, but it doesn't actually do anything.
Good to know, but do you think that we'll get to doing something on that?
That's a great question. And we are old enough to know that people say that they want to do a lot of things and make a lot of lists and say, I'd like to do this and I'd like to do that. But to unwind a decision like Ambler Road takes many, many steps. And so, and you'll remember that they tried to execute those permits in the previous Trump administration and got blocked by a court because they didn't consult with the tribes enough. We believe that there's so much science, and the consultation that did happen in the last couple of years proved that trying to permit that road is just a bad idea. And so we're hoping that if Burgum gets the position as Interior Secretary, that he'll look at the facts of what's going on up there at Gates of the Arctic and say, we're not going to touch it. And he did say in his hearing that he would make sure every inch of parks are protected, and that would include Gates of the Arctic. And so we want to really appeal to his love of parks to see if he'll reject that idea of reversal.
As I said at the beginning of the show, one administration changes and another one comes in. We see a lot of temporary changes until they get their footing. I understand there's a freeze on hiring across the federal government. Is that impacting the National Park Service in any way?
Yeah, unfortunately it is. And we're really, really concerned about it. So the hiring freeze executive order was put into place on Monday. Then a memo came out from the Office of Personnel and Management, and it said that seasonals wouldn't get touched. And then yesterday, people all over the country who had been hired as seasonals for many, many parks got a notification over email that their job offer that they had was rescinded. So we are extremely worried about the workforce at the Park Service. The Park Service absolutely depends on the seasonal workforce in order to effectively manage parks, support visitors, and just make sure the resources are protected. And so we don't know how many people were affected by that first round, I would say, that happened yesterday. We believe it could potentially grow to be well over 1,000 people. could be affected. But if they don't fill the positions that have been open, don't allow hiring of seasonals, this could be so problematic for the parks, especially as the spring season begins. The flood of visitors that come into parks, and you know this living in Utah, all the Utah parks get amazing millions upon millions of visitors, and it's only grown. And I think at places like Zion, quadrupled in the last few years. If there are not seasonal workers on the ground, seasonal rangers in parks, making sure the trash is picked up, making sure the bathrooms are clean, helping visitors find their way, making sure the resources remain protected, your visit to our national parks this spring and summer could be completely ruined by having basic services not being handled in the parks. And so this could be a disaster for parks if this hiring freeze continues to affect the permanent staff and the seasonal staff. So we're really worried. You probably know this too, Kurt. There are superintendent positions that haven't been filled yet. So, and there's going to be upcoming retirements of park superintendents in big parks. This could be a total disaster, this hiring freeze. And so we really might need Congress to step in and stop it, because all these families who've booked their hotel rooms and think they're going to have great family vacations in the spring and summer might be confronted with piles of trash, uncleaned bathrooms, and so forth. So maybe these ideas of hiring freezes seem like great ideas on paper and efficiencies in the public. For parks, total disaster.
Yeah, I wonder if that 1,000 number that you offered up is on a low side, because seasonal hiring with the parks really ramps up in spring and summer, and the agency grows to 20,000 employees. So it
more than that.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Our experts on appropriations and budget, we've been trying to crunch the numbers to figure out exactly, how many people this might be. Ultimately, how many seasonals within a 12-month period are in our national parks. And our best guess right now is over 4,000. And you think about this, when you go on to, let's just say, the Glacier National Park website right now, it says, we're hiring seasonals. We need 350 seasonals to take care of Glacier National Park this summer. That's just one park, 350 seasonals that they need. If those people are not allowed to be hired, what is that going to do for Glacier this summer and spring? Just the problems that can occur are so bad. And that's just one park. But this could be a massive problem.
Kristen, you mentioned the people flocking to the national parks. Spring is coming, summer is coming. People, if they don't have their plans already, they're going to make them really soon. What about overcrowding in the parks? I mean, back in 1978, Congress, when it passed the National Parks and Recreation Act, and then in the 2006 management policies of the Park Service, it told superintendents to identify carrying capacities. Why are so many parks haven't gotten to that point yet?
To identify a carrying capacity?
Yes.
Well, I think there was a movement early on to do it and to figure out what is the threshold of how many people can we have in a park before we start harming resources.
Right.
And there was such a blowback in Congress, and people didn't like the idea of setting a limit. And so that carried some weight over the years and sort of scared agencies into doing it. And then now we had parks becoming just wildly popular in the 2010s. And then you had COVID, where people flooded into parks, and people actually said, wow, this overcrowding can really be a problem. This is a lot of people. And I think that kind of brought these ideas back into the foreground. And what happened is you had a park like Rocky Mountain in Colorado, which if you've been there in the last 15 years, it is hard to get a parking spot there. And I remember when my oldest daughter was 1, and I was carrying her in a baby backpack, and my husband drove us to the nearest parking lot at Bear Lake, had to drive all the way back to park the car and then run up the hill to come meet us. And that was 14 years ago. And so what Rocky did in the last 5 years was actually look at that carrying capacity and say, okay, here are the popular areas of Rocky. They looked at Bear Lake itself because it has a huge parking lot. And what they did was they said, okay, we're going to create these limits, and we're going to have a separate limit for the general park and then one for Bear Lake. And that's been working. And people were upset about it at first, and then they had to make adjustments to it. And now you only have to have a reservation, starting at a certain time in the morning. So if you wanted to escape the reservation system, you could scoot in the morning before the reservation system starts.
Sure.
So they've adapted their reservation system, but man, like, it's nice to know that if you drive to Bear Lake, you can get a parking spot now. And I think Americans have grown to love these reservation systems and know that for certain they can get into a park and they know what time they can get in so they can plan their day around it. So these carrying capacities parks need to look into them. They need to look at visitor experience, and we don't see the numbers going down. I mean, I know you talked about that earlier, Kurt, about whether or not Great Smokies has an accurate number, but I think you and I both know, because we go to so many parks, that they're very, very popular, and there are millions of people in them. And I torture my kids by making them go to parks with me in the middle of the day, just so I could see how many humans are in these places. And I will tell you, our hiking experiences are way different when we go in at noon than when we go in at 8 in the morning. And
Sure.
so regardless of whether or not Great Smokies is going to shift 1 million up or 1 million down, there's still a ton of people there. And I have been completely stuck in traffic getting out of Great Smokies at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I have also been stuck behind a parade of cars in Cades Cove and just had to enjoy being stuck because there were a couple of deer in the meadow. And so which I could go out of my house right now and probably see 10 deer in Maryland. But, these places are very crowded, and we have to get a handle on them, and we have to make sure we're not getting to limits where it becomes unenjoyable and that we're hurting the very resources that the Park Service is seeking to protect.
No, absolutely. You said people like reservations. I think they like the concept of reservations. I know every year I hear plenty of complaints about recreation.gov and how, I was there when the portal opened and within seconds it was full. So that's something that the Park Service and the Forest Service have to figure out a better system, I think. With all the reservations you need anymore, whether it's Rocky Mountain or whether it's hiking in Great Smoky Mountains, or whether you want to get in and drive go into the Sun Road or climb up to Angel's Landing, there is incredible demand for these experiences, and I'm not exactly sure the current recreation.gov is an equitable platform, but we're not going to discuss that today because that could take up a full show.
No, and I'm not saying that rec.gov is perfect at all. And clearly, all of these online systems, some of them are good and some of them, are not so good. I mean, I can't even get a ticket to a concert in Washington, D.C. anymore when I try to get them. So, and there have been issues with this in many venues and many things within our lives. And so, but what I think the Park Service can do, and what they have been doing, is making adjustments to try to squeeze people in when they can at different times of the day, and really make adjustments to the timing of these reservation systems. And so I think it would. I hope it wouldn't surprise people to know how hard the Park Service is working to make certain adjustments to the reservation systems to make it easier on people. and to make it so that if you show up in a park and you honestly didn't know there was a reservation system, there's still a way to squeeze you in. And so I think they do a lot of thinking about that. And I have to tell you, one of the parks that I think has really put a lot of thinking into visitor management is Arches. I think sitting down with the Park Service staff a couple of years ago and talking about the thought process they've gone through to move visitors around Arches, it's impressive. It's impressive how much social science they're using, how much they're surveying people about their visits to these parks. It's a really impressive operation, and I definitely urge people who are curious about visitor use management to learn more about it, because it's a really interesting planning process the parks go through.
Change of administrations. Chuck Sams has left the Park Service. Secretary Howland has left the Interior Department. We have an acting director of the National Park Service, the comptroller of the Park Service. If and when a permanent Park Service director is nominated and confirmed by the Senate, they've got a full slate of tasks to tackle, and not too many of them are wonderful tasks. I mean, the morale of the Park Service has been low for years. How does the next Park Service director deal with that? I mean, a lot of the things that are morale busters are something the Park Service director has no control of, like pay or housing, or like having enough staff to not overwhelm somebody, the whole work quality of life balance.
Let me put a thought out there. If for some reason in the next few days or weeks, the Park Service is asked to eliminate remote workers, talk about killing morale. That would kill morale in such a dramatic way. And the other way it would kill morale is that if those remote workers were touched, those are some of the people who are doing HR. Those are people who are doing project management. So it has this ripple effect where you may not be able to even do your job effectively if they just start wiping out entire segments of the workforce at the Park Service. And so, yes, if you're the incoming Park Service director and you're showing up and this hiring freeze is being implemented in all sorts of ways, you are definitely going to be confronted with a workforce that is very, very unhappy. And, we've been sort of working on the housing issue. It's not really in our bailiwick as a conservation group, but because it has affected so many parks, we had to dig in a little bit. Congress didn't end up passing a bill on park housing by the end of last year, and we need more Great American Outdoors Act money and other funds in order to build more housing. So, yeah, expecting park staff to continue to live in dilapidated living environments is terrible, and that needs to be corrected. And we thought there was a lot of energy around that last year in both Congress and in the administration, and some has been happening. A lot of money has been directed toward Yellowstone, for instance, and they've been able to get a lot of upgrades in their housing, but the rest of the parks haven't. So we're very, very concerned about where that's going to stand. And just in general, some of the morale issues that already pre-exist in the Park Service. We're definitely worried about our friends in the Park Service, and really feel like these folks need to be taken care of better. And I don't know what to say, Kurt. I'm just not feeling great this morning after seeing how the hiring freeze is beginning to be implemented. I'm feeling very, very sad about our friends within the National Park Service and where staffing is being treated right now. Very worried about these folks.
Yeah. You mentioned the housing issues with Park Service employees. Some months back, we had a conversation about the ever-rising cost of lodging costs for park visitors. Is that something you're taking a look at, or is that something that is just going to keep going up?
We haven't taken a hard look at that with the concessioners, but we know how expensive it is because we stay in these lodging facilities all the time, and we know the price of a hotel room at the Awani is through the roof.
Well, that's the Awani. I mean, I'm talking about, a century-old cabin at $300 a night, or a very small cabin in Yellowstone for $300 a night. It's interesting at Mammoth Cave National Park. They just the lodge got much needed renovation, and you're not spending $300 a night there. It might be $200 a night. Back in 2018, late 2017, you probably know this better than I do. For some reason, the Park Service agreed to let concessionaires in some parks charge market rates.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand the wisdom behind that. These are America's national parks paid for with American tax dollars, and it just seems like saying that a lodge in this park has to have lodging rates comparable to what gateway towns charge. I don't. That's apples and oranges. It shouldn't matter.
Yeah, I know your exact point. I see you, and making parks unaffordable for people to visit is not good, and we, it's definitely a huge concern. And like I said, personally have experienced it, and professionally have experienced it, and it's certainly something that we need to address moving forward with these concession contracts.
Getting back to the next Park Service director, if we're going to see one during the first Trump administration, there wasn't a Senate-confirmed Park Service director. We went from acting director to acting director to acting director, and the politics placed on those acting directors were incredible, from what I understand. New Year's Eve, we saw the state of Montana sue the Park Service, the Interior Department, Yellowstone National Park Superintendent Cam Shawley over bison management plans. Go back to 2018, and we saw Yellowstone Superintendent Dan Wenk basically forced into retirement because of a disagreement over how many bison were enough and how many were too many with then Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. What's your crystal ball tell you on bison management in Yellowstone and bison numbers and, that lawsuit?
It's so interesting, right? That, I mean, just before we get into the micro issues with bison management in Yellowstone, let's just pull back for a second. People love seeing bison and they love the backstory on bison, right? That people who came westward diminished the bison herds, and there were 23 wild bison left, and they were all in Yellowstone. And all of the bison that you see in Yellowstone today are, those 23 bison are their ancestors. It's a fun story, and people love hearing it. And the way that bison management is thought of by the state of Montana, you would think these were evil animals, but they're very beloved, and they're even on the interior, symbol, and the
Park
Park
Service
Service
shield.
symbol, the shield, and so arrowhead, and so these are sort of like these beloved creatures, but the fact that they are suing over population growth of bison and also these transitional zones where bison like to go in the wintertime. The reality is we have to figure out how to steward these bison together, and that this continued fight over how big the population can get. In my time of doing this work, that number has gone up and down 1,000. And so I think scientists are trying to come up with what the right number of the herd is. I think the latest bison management plan that came out, again, it's a logical plan in many cases in terms of where the population can be. But we need those zones outside of the park for the bison to sort of roam in the wintertime. And I think the program that Dan Wenk started, moving the bison to tribal lands when the population does get too high, has been fairly good from what I've heard. And so we want to maintain that. But you and I both saw what happened when bison were just being, hazed to keep them out of the state of Montana. And it's cruel, and even the slaughter of thousands of bison at the end of every season. These practices are so arcane and cruel that I thought moving the bison to tribal lands was a very great compromise. But I don't know, this continues to be a battle. It should really be cooperative. And I think Cam has done a good job of trying to be cooperative. And I think Dan Wenk did a great job of being cooperative with the states. I think there are these private personas that governors have with the Park Service where they call them up and, talk to them and want to be helpful when Yellowstone gets flooded and all of this stuff. And then there's this public persona where it's like, if we don't like what you're doing, we're just going to sue you. And so I think we all need to just work together on this and realize that the public, whether they live in Montana or New York, love to come and see the bison in Yellowstone. And we just have to work this out and figure it out. We'll likely intervene on behalf of the Park Service in this lawsuit.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious to see how Montana is going to deal with the whole bison issue, because it's not just Yellowstone. The Blackfoot Nation has its own bison herd. They want to increase the bison herd. The Park Service at Glacier National Park would be more than happy to let bison from the Blackfoot Nation roam into Glacier. And if they roam into Glacier, they will increase their population. Anyway, never a dull moment in national parks or National Park Service. Speaking of tribes, we saw a big push during the Biden administration to get more tribal involvement with various management angles of national parks. Unfortunately, the Biden administration was not very transparent in exactly explaining all those agreements. They told me I'd have to file a FOIA request to get that information. Regardless, the Trump administration during the first time had sometimes fractious relationship with tribes. Any insights on whether those co-management agreements will continue to grow under the current Trump administration, or whether there will be they'll fade away?
It's a great question. Watching the Burgum hearing last week, he's got great relationships with the tribes. And so on one hand, I could really see those co-stewardship agreements continuing under Burgum because he has such a fantastic relationship with so many tribes. But they've done a lot of them, hundreds of them, Kurt, in so many national park units. And so is there more to do? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's more clamoring out there for more agreements, because I think I went to Secretary Holland's farewell speech, and I think they said there were over 400 agreements. So it may not, we may not see more, but I think some of the agreements that I've seen are good. It's helping with fire management, helping with law enforcement. Every agreement is different, and every sort of like issue identified where the tribes could help co-steward. For each park that I've seen, they've all been completely different. And so having that additional help, seems to be a good thing. And so, yeah, but I don't know if there will be a lot more.
No, I'd just be curious to see some of the details and which tribes they've signed with, because you take a park like Yellowstone, and I think they've got well over a dozen associated tribes. So which tribes are those agreements done with, and what do they provide for? I'm sorry.
I've talked to some attorneys who work for the tribes in different places. And I remember having a conversation with one attorney for the tribes in Oklahoma, and he asked me, what does the Park Service mean when they say co-stewardship? What would they like us to do? And he said to me, I don't know that we have the capacity to really sign an agreement and help. And so that's the other issue, is that many tribes don't have the staff resources to really make some of these agreements happen. And so, yes, you're saying there are, 11 tribes that work with Yellowstone, but I'm not sure all of them have the capacity to help with stewardship responsibilities.
Yeah, no, it's curious. Well, Kristen, we could go on for another hour, but you've got valuable time that you've got things to do. I appreciate your insights today. It's definitely going to be interesting going forward. Have you heard anything on well, I guess we got to wait to see if Mr. Burgum gets confirmed as Interior Secretary before we start talking about who are candidates for Park Service Director.
Yeah, there's just a little bit of mild speculation on Park Service Director, but nothing concrete on that yet. And my understanding is that Burgum hopefully will be able to select his bureau chiefs. So, but I would guess his vote is going to come up pretty soon. So he might be installed as soon as next week. But we can continue to have this conversation, Kurt, and see who's going to be leading the Park Service and how we're going to address all of these really complicated issues and take care of the staff there. So I look forward to talking to you more about it in the coming weeks and months. But yeah, we'll see what happens after Burgum gets installed.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see if they go back to the agency and try and bring one of the career Park Service personnel into the director's office, or if they go back outside the agency, whether it's to another federal agency or even outside federal government, as the Trump administration or as the Biden administration did.
Yeah, I think many names start to float around, both in and out of the administration, but there's so many people who campaign for these jobs that you never know if they're really being vetted for them. So it's hard to tell unless someone tells you concretely that I am being vetted for it. I've gotten the phone call from the personnel office of the White House. But, there are some really amazing people within the Park Service who would do a great job being Park Service Director. And there are also, as you know, Kurt, some retired Park Service people who might consider coming back, who would do an excellent job running the Park Service. And so I would love it if this administration called NPCA and asked us for a list of people that we think would be great for those positions. And we invite that request. And we have provided names in the past, and so for both Secretary of Interior and various positions on the Park Service. So let's keep our fingers crossed that we get someone good.
That's Kristen Brengel. She's the Senior Vice President for Government Affairs at the National Parks Conservation Association. Kristen, thanks so much for joining me today, and I'm sure we'll be talking in the weeks and months ahead.
Thanks.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it informative. Going forward, we'll be watching carefully as the new staff and secretary arrive at the Interior Department and whether we'll see a nominee for Director of the National Park Service. You can follow along by watching for updates on the National Parks Traveler. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchak. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.